So in a sentence, give me your take on the quarterback on the opposite side, Jameis Winston.
Jameis Winston could be the Tom Brady from 2020 that we see in 2021. His style meshing with Sean Payton's style might be exactly what he needed at this point in his career.
Which player is going to surprise us most with his performance this week?
I'm going to go with Kyler Murray from the Cardinals. You look at the receiving core, DeAndre Hopkins and AJ Green on the outside, Christian Kirk, and now Rondale Moore on the inside. That's a pretty good receiving core. And I just think there's so many weapons for Arizona. You factor in Kyler's running ability. I think it's going to be tough for him not to put up points.
Hi, and welcome to the Off the Charts podcast. I'm Mark Simon, joined by Football Rookie Handbook co-authors Nathan Cooper.
Hey, Mark. How's it going? Thanks for having me.
And Alex Vigderman.
Hi.
Our VP of Football, Matt Minicherian, will join us in a little while. That audio you just heard, some of the highlights of our show from week one. Good call, Coop, on Kyler Murray. You also heard Matt talking about Jameis Winston and Sean Payton being a good match. An 80% positive play percentage. That sounds like a good match to me. We all drew it up this way, right? Teddy Bridgewater being the number one quarterback in total points, Tyrod Taylor being number 3, and Aaron Rodgers being something like number 35, 36, 37, of course. Here we are for week 2. And before we go ahead to week 2, let me ask you both. What was the one thing that surprised you the most in week 1? Coop, start us off.
I think we all agree that there's no question it has to be the Saints destroying the Packers. The Saints are good, but I don't think we were expecting that type of blowout. So for a less obvious one, I'm going to go back to that Cardinals-Titans game. You know, I said last week Kyler Murray would be sort of a surprise. He's going to put up points, but I wasn't expecting the Titans offense to only be held to 13 points. And Derrick Henry only, averaging less than a yard per carry at halftime. The Cardinals defense did a good job limiting Henry in the run game, AJ Brown and Julio Jones in the pass game as well. And now you have the Titans. They're 0-1. They have a tough test in Seattle. So I think this is getting to be a bit of a desperation time for the Titans, even though it's only week 2. Going down 0-2 is not something that you want to look forward to for an NFL team.
Ryan Tannehill last among quarterbacks in total points and not even close. Who would have figured that he would have been negative? Aaron Rodgers negative, Ben Roethlisberger negative, Matt Ryan negative. Alex, what surprised you the most?
I will mention about Aaron Rodgers. This was his lowest on-target percentage in a game in like 5 years. So it was anomalous. But I will say, in an MVP season last year, he had a game kind of like this against the Buccaneers. So I expect him to bounce back.
So he basically got it out of the way right now?
You could argue that. I mean, the problem is that people react so extremely to what you see first or what you see last that it might throw people off. But yeah, I think it's very likely that he has a perfectly fine season with just this weird game thrown in there. And
speaking of overreaction, Alex, start us off. Is there any other overreaction from week 1 that we should be particularly wary of?
I think in general, it's just good practice to not take one game and try and extract some change in general about what a team's trying to do. The Cowboys-Bucks game is a perfect example of this. The Cowboys threw the ball in like 80% of early downs, and that's just not a thing. If they did that for the entire season, they would blow away the pass-run ratio record. And the Bucks have a stout defensive front. That's a team where you're going to have scheme-specific plans, and we don't necessarily want to take that and run with it and make assumptions about how a team's going to go in future weeks. Similarly, in general, we want to be patient when evaluating where teams stand. When the Eagles blow out the Falcons or Josh Allen looks like he's regressing against the Steelers, 2 teams are involved there, right? So the Eagles did a little bit better than expected. The Falcons did a little worse than expected. We have to acknowledge that when we have one game of information, it's probably a little bit of both, and we're not necessarily learning a complete set of information about each team.
Otherwise, we'd have the Texans in the Super Bowl, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Coop?
That's where I'm going. I'm going with the Texans. I think the overreaction is all of a sudden the Texans aren't going to be a bad team or even the worst team. You got to realize here they played against a Jacksonville team who has a rookie quarterback, a rookie head coach, not a great roster. This team's still in rebuild mode. Tyrod Taylor surely, isn't a slouch at quarterback. Definitely a good quarterback. Brandon Cooks is a proven big play receiver, but I would be very surprised to see this week's game against Cleveland if it's not in, double digits throughout most of the game here. So, Texans played well week 1, but you have to realize, they were playing a Jacksonville team who, is rebuilding and still doing a lot themselves.
Teams in the West 8-0 in week 1, AFC West, NFC West combined. Teams in the NFC North all lost. AFC South, the only winner was the Texans. So some interesting things certainly happening in week 1. Was there anything trendy from week one in terms of approaches? I'm not necessarily asking for something where you necessarily delved into it, but just instinctively off of what you saw from flipping around the channels this week for either of you guys. Was there anything trendy from week one?
Trendy. I mean, I think a continuation of the trend of being aggressive, like the rate at which teams went for it on fourth down has doubled over the last couple of years. And that's just going to keep going, I think, to some extent. And week one, especially teams with new coaching staffs and stuff like that, they're probably going to be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more experimental than they might towards the end of the season. So I would expect them to be more aggressive in week one than in week 14, but still that trend's definitely continuing.
Was there anything that we saw in week one where you're like, yep, this is how it's going to be for this team this season, and where week one was a really good indicator of what we're going to see?
I think whenever you look at a team like maybe the Rams, just because I want to go Matthew Stafford, I want to talk about him a little bit. I think it was really something that we all expected, especially as a Lions fan. You saw a lot of what Matthew Stafford can do. Not many people can say that because they probably didn't watch too many Lions games. What he did with that Rams offense is something that I think is going to be a year-long type of thing. I think what he can do with a running game, what he can do with an offensive line, and what he can do with those weapons at receiver is going to be really special, I think, for LA and having a big run, not only during the regular season, but also into the playoffs as well.
Threw for 321 yards and 3 scores. I just want to run down the top 5 quarterbacks in total points as we enter week 2. Teddy Bridgewater in the top spot at about 14. Now that's interesting to me because Coop, you were all over the Broncos in the preseason when we were talking about them, and I guess you kind of got what you were hoping for in that first game.
Yeah, Bridgewater played well. The biggest thing with him is not trying to force too much. He was a guy last year who didn't really push the ball down the field very much as well. And I think you could see a little bit of that middle ground, I think, on Sunday. Pushed it down the field when he needed to, but then was also more of that game manager whenever that time called for it as well. I think good running game with Gordon and Williams is going to be helpful. Cortland Sutton was barely even part of the offense as well. So obviously he's probably going to step up now with Jerry Jeudy out. But I think that offense with Bridgewater, I think is going to be perfectly fine. And you got to hope that defense can kind of keep him in games as well.
You talked up Cortland certainly during the previous shows that we've done. All right. Let's look ahead to the week 2 slate. But first, let me finish the top 5. Teddy Bridgewater's 1, Dak Prescott 2, Tyrod Taylor 3. We thought of that before. Patrick Mahomes, about where you thought he would be. He's 4th, and Tom Brady 5th. So your top 5 has 2 guys that are certainly likely to be mainstays. Dak certainly could be a mainstay this year. And then Bridgewater and Taylor are certainly wild cards, with Bridgewater figuring to be better. All right, so let's look ahead to the week 2 slate. Marquee game this week. Chiefs, Ravens. Chiefs could have easily lost week 1 to the Browns. They rallied from 9 down in the fourth quarter. Ravens lost to the Raiders in overtime. They got chewed up by Derek Carr quite a bit. Lamar, 3 fumbles, didn't get protected well. Coop, start us off. What's your biggest take going into this game?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a good one. I don't think the Ravens run game is dynamic enough or as dynamic without J.K. Dobbins, without Gus Edwards, those kind of guys. But I think it's still good. Tyson Williams, I think, is perfectly fine. Lamar Jackson, obviously running himself, he's going to get plenty of opportunities there. So it may still be a little bit of an issue for the Chiefs defense. So I'm looking a little bit elsewhere than that. Whenever these two teams played each other last year in week 3, Mahomes threw for 385 yards and 4 touchdowns. The leading receiver was Travis Kelce with only 87 yards. Mahomes spread the ball around quite a bit. You look at last week, Mahomes had over 300 yards and Tyreek Hill almost had 200 of them. So he had a heck of a week, one of those weeks that, he did multiple times last year. And then you have a Ravens defense that gave up 435 yards to Derek Carr. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if the Ravens secondary can limit the Chiefs passing game. It's hard for any secondary to limit Mahomes and the Chiefs offense, but I wonder if the Ravens can keep up with them on the scoreboard. I think that's going to be the biggest thing, in my opinion.
Alex, I'll come back to one thing that you said, Nate. Alex, what do you got?
I'm in the same boat there. I'm probably a little bit more bearish on the Ravens' ability to keep up here. They've lost the last 3 meetings against the Chiefs. The Chiefs put up at least 27 points in all of them. And we know that the Ravens have a limited running game this year relative to previous years. In their first game, they had by yards after contact per carry and by broken missed tackles per attempt. This was one of the worst games since Jackson has become the quarterback. So just not as much explosion there. And when you're a team that's as balanced as they are and really does lean on the running game to be able to set up their entire offense, and you're losing just a little bit of that edge, running is already inefficient enough as a play concept that you might be kind of running uphill, especially against a team that really is going to put up a lot of points against you. Jackson also has had 2 of his 10 worst passing points earned performances against the Chiefs in those few games. So I'm just not super optimistic for Baltimore here, even though there's obviously a lot of marquee to that matchup.
Coop, was there anything about Lamar that concerned you from week 1?
I don't think there was anything concerning. I think he played, especially in week 1 of a season. I think he played as well as he could. Obviously, the fumble was the big thing, turn around towards the end of the game. But he was that type of dynamic player with his legs, threw some good passes. I think he's going to progress throughout the rest of the season, and take this as sort of that learning step, and just kind of chalk it away as this is the first game of the year, and hopefully go into this game with a little better mindset in terms of, being more dynamic offense as a whole. And obviously this is going to be a tough one against the Chiefs. So we'll see how well can do against this Chiefs defense. I think it's going to be a good game. I think, they've played each other the past couple of years pretty well. And I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch. Give
me a scenario in which the Ravens go 12-5, 13-4 off a week 1 loss.
I think it's definitely possible. I think Lamar plays well. They're still waiting on Rashad Bateman, their first round pick, to come back. I think that's going to make the passing game a little bit more dynamic. Right now, their number 1 is Sammy Watkins, the former Chiefs receiver. So you have Watkins, you have Duvernay, you have Marquise Browns, which are, solid receivers. But I think getting Bateman out there is, the reason why they took him in the first round. That'll make him a little bit more dynamic. And I think everything coming together, obviously the injuries hurt, especially the run game, a little bit on the defensive side. But I think if everything holds strong from here on out, it's definitely still dynamic enough of a team to win 12 games.
So in a sentence for this game, what's your biggest single point to keep in mind?
Watch for the Chiefs passing attack to be too much for the Ravens. I think that the Chiefs win here. Alex,
are you with that?
Yeah, I think the Chiefs passing attack being too much plus the Ravens passing attack not being quite together yet.
All right, let's segue to Bills Dolphins. I feel like this is the moment in the show where if you're a classic listener of the Off the Charts Football Podcast, where Aaron Schatz says something like, well, the Dolphins have an X% chance of making the playoffs if they win, and then you go half X, and that's their chance of making the playoffs if they lose, because a win would make them 2-0 with wins over the Pats and the Bills, and it would make Buffalo 0-2. So a good amount at stake for the Dolphins in this game. Josh Allen, week 1, some issues. He took a bunch of deep shots. They didn't go well. Bills' offensive line by total points appears not to have done particularly well. Tua, stat-wise, somewhere in the middle. Bills and Dolphins. Alex, start us off on this one.
So you mentioned the offensive line. The Bills blew the most blocks of any team in week 1, but that was against perhaps the best defensive front in the league in the Steelers. So that's one of those things where it's
overreact.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So Josh Allen, not the best game, but again, against the Steelers, I think we can reasonably expect that he would not have had a great performance. He did not have a particularly great performance against them last year when he had an MVP caliber campaign. Ben Solak actually did a pretty good deep dive for the Ringer on the Bills Steelers, and how the Steelers defense presents a real conundrum for the Bills, and the performance of Josh Allen was less of a regression and more of just a situational thing. But there obviously is some regression built in there. Allen had one of the best starts of his career against the Dolphins last year, and this time threw for over 400 yards on only 35 attempts. So I think he has a good chance to bounce back. On the Dolphins side, Tua had the lowest on-target rate in the NFL in week 1, which is Matt and I a couple of weeks ago said that Tua was the breakout quarterback. That tempers that a little bit. Got Jalen Waddle involved early, which is good to see from a rookie receiver, especially one coming off an injury. Another thing to watch is that the Dolphins defense had 23 pressures, which is a lot in week 1, and had no sacks. So that ratio is not something that you'd expect to persist, but also that's a lot of pressures from a defense that's not necessarily we're expecting to be like an elite pass rush. So I'm kind of curious to see how that works out.
Yeah, on the Dolphins side, there's just a couple other numbers, not as deep as what you just gave, Alex, but some interesting things that I saw were they put up only 259 yards of offense, and New England had 393. So that's something that's interesting there. In terms of third downs, the Patriots converted almost 70%, and the Dolphins only had 36%. And then the other thing, time of possession favored the Patriots, by 13 minutes as well. So by, all accounts here, the Dolphins should have lost this game. There was a few timely fumbles, especially the one late in the fourth quarter in the red zone. They were going in for the go-ahead score. So I worry about that a little bit from the Dolphins side. I do agree with you, Alex. There's a lot of good things to like on the Dolphins defensive side, but I worry if they play this way against Buffalo this weekend, I think it could get a little ugly. But talking about the Bills, you talked about Josh Allen. In terms of the Bills as a whole, they were able to move the ball up and down the field, even on the Steelers defense. They just had a fumble, a block punt for a touchdown, and then getting stopped twice on fourth down as well. That sort of nullified everything. Josh Allen, 81% of his catchable percentage was near the bottom quarter of the league this last week in week 1. And again, I think you alluded to it. The Pittsburgh defense is really good, and I think that factored in a little bit. So the thing that we're worried about a little bit, and that we've talked about with Josh Allen and the regression, is that accuracy and making sure that accuracy stays at that consistent point of where it got last year and doesn't regress. And if that accuracy can stay to where it was last year, because he was under 60% last week. So it's a little bit of a concern. Again, it was the Steelers defense, but we need to see more of what he did last year to really consider him that top tier quarterback.
You mentioned 81% catchable. What do you want the catchable number to be?
You want to be closer to 90. You want to be around that 88 to 89, 90%. So if you're looking at, some of the guys that really did well last week, you're talking about guys that were, 90 to 95%. But again, this is week 1.
Yeah, you want to be 36 out of 40 instead of 32 out of 40, basically. And that's 4 more catchable, 4 more potential completions that you could get. Yeah,
ideally. That's sort of what I'm looking for. Alex, you can, go a different way here if you want.
No, I will actually tag along to sort of the risk associated with Allen regressing on this team that is as pass happy as they've been, and they had Zach Moss go out as well. If they're going to be this pass happy and Josh Allen isn't an MVP level or substantially above average quarterback, then that's a lot to put on a guy who's not necessarily up for it.
What's the scenario by which the Dolphins win the AFC East?
I mean, you have to see more from Tua, I think.
Got to win this one, right? You got to start 2-0.
I mean, you got to start 2-0 and put your biggest division rival in a hole. That obviously is a huge deal.
Tua for like 350 this week.
350 might be a bit rich, but I do think getting the skill position guys involved. Gesicki is a an elite athlete as well, and so I think that there's some opportunity to have a pretty explosive offense. I wouldn't necessarily say too much about the running game, but I don't think that that's too big of a deterrent. And if they can get pressure like they did in week 1, that's a huge deal as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, first of all, you look at the Dolphins defense. I think this defense needs to play just like it did last week. Again, the Patriots probably moved the ball on them a little bit more than you'd like, but that the defense getting a lot of pressures, that's going to be huge here throughout the season. And yeah, I'd like to see Tua be a little bit more accurate and involve a little bit more of his passing game. Really like to see Waddle, what he did last week, and see them progress on that. Yeah, I think if they win this week, I think it really sets them up for a good position to take that moving forward throughout the rest of the season.
So Coop's priority this week, Dolphins defense. They got to be better statistically than they were in week 1. Alex, your 1-sentence summary on this game.
I just want to see if accuracy is a big thing for these two quarterbacks. So are they going to be accurate?
So let's segue to 49ers Eagles. You couldn't have asked for anything more for Philadelphia in week 1. Crushed the Falcons. Jalen Hurts looked good passing it and running it. Devonta Smith scored a touchdown. Miles Sanders, big game. Every other team in the division lost. Eagles have a very, very tough schedule ahead. Cowboys, Chiefs, and Bucks in their next 5. 49ers had a very weird ending, but the first 55 minutes or so were pretty good. Jimmy G played well. Trey Lance came off the bench, threw for a touchdown. 49ers D, good passing points saved. Nate, scouting-wise, first of all, your take on the Eagles and how good Jalen Hurts can be.
Yeah, Jalen Hurts looked like the guy that I think they hoped that he would. He looked really good. They were able to throw the ball. They were able to run the ball. He didn't force anything, didn't turn the ball over, which is definitely a key for him. Coming out, we had Hurts as our number 8 quarterback and more of that circumstantial type of starter. And our own Bryce Rossler, he wrote him up, big Oklahoma guy, so he watched him quite a bit his last season. Instead, his key factors were mobility, arm strength, and leadership. And I think those are things that are pretty apparent when you watch Jalen Hurts. The mobility is something that's going to keep defenses honest. And where he can get in trouble is the eye discipline and making good decisions under pressure. He was one of the least pressured quarterbacks in week 1. In turn, that allowed him to complete 77% of his passes. So that's going to be something interesting to watch. They're able to get more pressure on him. Does he have the decision-making skills? to make the good decisions, make the good throws, and not force balls and turn the balls over. I don't think he can sustain what he did last week, but if he does that with any sort of regularity, I think this could be a surprise team for throughout the rest of the season, especially the way the defense played.
I don't think he can sustain what he did last week because he threw his average depth of target was under 4. So we're talking about a lot of short throws, a lot of quick throws. And just in general, if you're going to do that over the course of a year, a defense is going to really adjust. And so I think that we're going to need to see something more from the skill position players. And they've added a lot of receiver talent, allegedly, in the draft over the last few years. And Devonta Smith had a nice start. And I think that they're going to need more downfield production to be able to be a more consistent offense. And obviously teams in general will put up more resistance than the Falcons did last week.
49ers injuries. How do we feel about those? Verrett and Mustard.
I'm worried about the Verrett injury. I think you could see it. As a Lions fan, I watched most of that game last week, and you could see it, especially in the fourth quarter. Whenever he went out, they started to attack the corners a little bit more, and I think it's going to be something that's going to be concerning, especially on the defensive side, because I think we're all in agreement that offense can be pretty good. It's going to be interesting how much more they utilize Trey Lance. He came in and had a few plays. I think they're going to start to creep him in there a little bit more as the season goes on. Obviously Deebo Samuel and George Kittle are their guys. They didn't even utilize Brandon Ayuk last week at all, which was a little surprising to me. With as much as they tried to get the ball in his hands last year in terms of whether it's through the passing game or the run game. So I think it's a little concerning with Verrett. I think they picked up Dre Fitzpatrick as sort of the replacement, so we'll see how well he does. But it may take a couple weeks to kind of get everything going on that defense.
Alex, I'll give you the scenario question. What's the scenario by which the Eagles go 11-6, 12-5?
I think the big things for them are going to be, can the pass rush still be pretty good? They've been very productive over the last few years in terms of getting pressure. Brandon Graham has really built himself quite a career as a pass rusher, and Fletcher Cox is obviously a force inside. The secondary needs to be acceptable, which it hasn't been over the last few years. Speaking of the Lions, Darius Slay, gotta see him be, the kind of shutdown guy that he has been at points in his career. And like I mentioned before, the skill position players, I think, need to step up over the last couple of years, especially towards the end of the year. Carson Wentz was throwing to nobodies. And so you got to have guys who stay healthy and guys who can get open and guys who can make plays after the catch. And in theory, they've drafted the kind of talent that can do that, but they just haven't had that kind of production in the last few years.
Eagles, Niners, summarize it in a sentence, Coop.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you need to look at Jalen Hurts. What's Jalen Hurts going to do? Like Alex said earlier, is he going to be able to push the ball down the field, or is the 49ers defense going to adjust to the short passes?
So to close, in 3 sentences, give me your analysis of any other game this week that you're particularly into. Coop.
I'm going to go with the Cowboys-Chargers game. It's in LA, but I wonder how many Cowboys fans are actually going to be in that stadium. So it's going to be interesting there. Dak looked great, as Alex said earlier. I don't think they're going to pass as much, like he alluded to as well, but he moved around really well, looked good. So I want to see him do the same against a Chargers defense that's pretty solid. And then for the Chargers, Rashawn Slater looked like the real deal at left tackle. And that offense, Justin Herbert, they didn't really miss a beat against Washington. So I think this is going to be a really good game and one to watch this weekend.
Coop speaks in long sentences. Alex.
So I want to talk about Rams and Colts. Obviously, we talked about Matthew Stafford already, but these are two teams with high-profile quarterbacks in new spots. The Rams had their highest EPA on 15-plus yard throws since the middle of 2019 against the Bears last week. So Stafford really showing some dividends early. An argument for pressures being a quarterback stat. Only in their game against the Steelers last year did the Colts have a higher pressure rate allowed to their quarterback than Carson Wentz experienced in week 1. We don't think that the offensive line just suddenly decided that they couldn't play as well. Wentz is a risk from that perspective. And if they can't have as productive of a passing offense as they had in terms of protecting the quarterback, that is a bit of a concern for them.
Matt felt really good about the Colts going into week 1. We'll see how he feels about week 2. When we come back, we'll take a break. We'll come back with Scouts and Stats. Thanks for tuning in. I want to make sure you're aware of where you can find some of our good content. Be sure to check out the SIS blog at sportsinfosolutionsblog.com. We'll have plenty of research and analysis on NFL and college football topics, plus baseball and basketball too. You can find us twice a week at Sharp Football at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Corey March has his regular look at the weekend props, plus we'll break down 3 intriguing NFL matchups for the week. All right, we're back for our final segment of the show, Scouts and Stats, which is slowly becoming a regular part of the show. We're going to talk about which team and player will be the biggest surprise in week 2. Let's start with team, and we bring in our VP of football, Matt Manacharian, and we ask him, what team will be the biggest surprise in week 2?
All right, I've got 2. I scoured, what the lines are for this week because I'm always way out of touch with that, and saw that the 0-1 Cowboys are 3.5-point dogs to the 1-0 Chargers. And the 1-0 Miami Dolphins are also 3.5-point, in this case, home dogs to the 0-1 Bills. I like the Dolphins and the Cowboys plus the points in either of these scenarios. This is a bit of a continuation of me fading Herbert and Allen after their unsustainably good 2020s. But I told you last week I was a big believer in the Cowboys offense. All Dak did was drop back 62 times for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns. The problem is he was tied for the third most pressured quarterback in week 1 with 19. Good thing for him is that the Chargers only pressured Washington football team quarterbacks on 9 plays in week 1. So I like that matchup. The scary part is Herbert potentially shredding the Cowboys secondary, but on a neutral field, I'd favor the Cowboys. So I like them to outperform Vegas's expectation here. On the Dolphins front, while Josh Allen led the NFL with being pressured 22 times en route to an underwhelming performance, the Dolphins actually pressured Mac Jones 19 times themselves. So despite Josh Allen's historical success against the Dolphins, 5-1 with 17 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. I think this game script might be a little more defensive minded. And on a neutral field, the 6.5-point line would be crazy here for me. So I think the Dolphins are, again, good value getting plus 3.5, in this case at home. Those are the 2 where I say I'm a little bit different than what I see out there from the public.
Alex, statistical take.
I'm kind of thinking about the Panthers here. And it's a little bit of the same kind of thing that I've been saying the last couple times. They barely beat the Jets in week 1, not particularly impressive, and are going against a Saints team that just drubbed the Packers. But the Panthers actually had one of the better team EPA figures in the league in week 1, despite not necessarily putting a ton of points on the board. And when you exclude garbage time from that stat, and the Saints are coming off a game in which they were very much on the positive end of the variance spectrum. So the Saints have drubbed the Panthers in week 17 each of the last 2 seasons, but in their early season matchups, they've actually been within a field goal. So I think that the Panthers can at least keep it close here.
We go to Coop for the scouting take.
I'm going to go with the Raiders. They go into Pittsburgh, which is a tough place to play. We've already talked about how good that defense is. But the way the Raiders played in the second half of that game against Baltimore, I think they have a shot to compete against with a lot of different teams. We talked about Derek Carr, but haven't really mentioned Darren Waller. Carr targeted him 19 times on Monday night, which is ridiculous. Everyone talks about Kelsey and Kittle, but I think Waller's in that discussion too. Obviously, the jury's still out on the Raiders defense as a whole, but I'll say this, Max Crosby is really good. He's a difference maker on the edge, and it really showed on Monday night whenever the time called for it. Because I really think the Steelers offense, if they play the way that they did against Buffalo, they really weren't playing that well until the fourth quarter came around. I really wouldn't be shocked if Vegas comes out of there with another win.
Could there be a scenario in which the Raiders go 12-5?
Max Crosby keeps being as sexy as he was last week, but I mean,
yeah,
that's a large ask.
Sexy with 2 X's.
Let's segue to player. Same question. What player will be the biggest surprise in week 2? Matt, your take.
Well, last week we talked about Teddy Bridgewater, Dak Prescott, Jameis Winston, Jamar Chase. They were pretty good, huh? One guy who didn't look so good was Aaron Rodgers. He looked like trash last week. He was nothing like himself. And unless he's personally tanking the team, I cannot imagine him looking like that again. So just to say, the Packers league low negative 18 EPA offensively. That's 5 points worse than the second worst total in the league. Rodgers himself had negative 5 passing points earned. Only Andy Dalton and Ryan Tannehill were worse from a passing perspective. I know people love to overreact, but it would be absolutely shocking to see a performance like this again, especially because it's on Monday Night Football. He's been in the top 5 in passing points earned each of the last 2 seasons. His third worst passing points earned game since the total points era began in 2016 was this past week. And everybody remembers last year when the Packers got destroyed by the Bucs in week 6. What happened the following week? 4 touchdowns and 0 interceptions for Aaron Rodgers. So to the extent that you can be surprised by Aaron Rodgers being good, get ready for it because I'm not ready to write him off.
I'm still reeling from the idea of Aaron Rodgers being a surprise in week 2.
You can call me out on that. That's totally legit.
No. I was going to, but
he was that bad. And just in case anybody's worried out there, it's really, really unlikely that he's going to continue to be that bad.
We're going to spell out relax now.
Also, he can't do poorly on Monday Night Football because that would tank his whole Jeopardy thing. We got to remember that this is an ABC game, right?
We have to watch out for that Lions defense, though.
Alex, your biggest surprise of week 2.
I'm going to stick with the Panthers here, actually. This is a bit of a shot in the dark, but I'm going to go with Jeremy Chin, safety for the Panthers. Jameis Winston threw a bunch of touchdowns, but he also was kind of inaccurate as he tends to be in week 1, particularly on overthrows. He had a bunch of overthrows, and give me Jeremy Chin as an option, as just like a guy who's going to be there on the back end of the defense as he overthrows a guy over the middle. Just perfect for an interception return, maybe for a touchdown.
All right, and Coop, close us out.
Well, Alex did a great job of offsetting my likely surprise thing with an unlikely surprise thing. I think we're balanced now.
And I'm going to go more along the lines of a breakout instead of more of a surprise. And I'm going to go with James Robinson for Jacksonville. He wasn't utilized much last week in their game, mainly because they were down early. They're not obviously going to run the ball much at that point. I obviously don't think that they're going to beat Denver this week, but I think they'll utilize him more as a rusher, especially early on in the game. And then as a receiver, he was targeted 6 times, had 3 catches last week. And this week, I think he'll come up with about 5 or 6 catches himself. Trevor Lawrence threw 51 passes, his first game of his career, and he targeted backs and tight ends 17 times. And that's what you want to look for in a young quarterback. You really utilize those checkdowns, which is why I think James Robinson is going to be kind of in that spot for a breakout. And I think this bodes well for him. And he obviously showed last year what he can do and that he can be a solid contributor, in this league.
This wraps up the Off the Charts Football Podcast. For Matt Manocherian, Nathan Cooper, Alex Vigderman, and our producer, Justin Stein, I'm Mark Simon. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.